What did you say? He's in that bag. He's in that bag.
Then I said, I don't know if that's him.
It could be you. You mentioned it being human bone, Sheila. Come on.
No. I have a background in radiology.
The bone was the first clue, a human bone found in a backyard burn pile. But the real horror came when Sheila Labarre's house revealed a secret so dark that it left even seasoned detectives shaken. In a chilling act of violence, Sheila didn't just kill. She tortured, manipulated, and held her victims in a twisted grip of fear. What police found in that house was only the beginning. Before we take you deeper into this terrifying story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more shocking true crime cases. Like the video if you want to hear about the hidden truths behind Sheila's twisted mind. The first sign that something was horribly amiss at Sheila Labarre's secluded home in Epping, New Hampshire, came on the morning of March 24, 2006, when police officers responded to a disturbing tip. The tip was not from a formal source, but from someone far more personal. Sheila herself, or at least, it was Sheila's voice. The 911 call made by Sheila early that morning was filled with panic, but there was something unsettling about her tone. Sheila had claimed that her former boyfriend, 24-year-old Kenneth County, had been unwell. In fact, Sheila said he had passed out and vomited the night before, but in the same breath, she denied that anything was wrong, or at least claimed that he had left the house. Gone to Massachusetts, she said. Yet County's family had been calling the police for days, worried about his whereabouts and well-being. They had been getting strange reports, and Sheila's evasive behavior had only deepened their concerns. It was the phone calls from County's family that set the wheels of the investigation in motion. They reported that Sheila was acting erratically, and most concerning of all, Kenneth had stopped contacting them. Given his history of maintaining regular contact, this was extremely out of character. They feared for his safety. That same day, a team of police officers, including Sergeant Gallagher, were dispatched to Sheila's home to check on County's whereabouts. As they approached the property, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The house, isolated on a sprawling property in a rural part of town, gave off an eerie silence. No one could have predicted what they would uncover once they stepped inside. Upon knocking, Sheila let the officers in without hesitation. They found her acting calm, but something about her demeanor unsettled them. Sheila insisted that County wasn't at the house and had left to go to Massachusetts, but the officers weren't buying it. As they looked around the property, it became apparent that the situation was far more disturbing than a simple disappearance. What they found in the backyard was what truly horrified them. Hidden among the clutter and remnants of an old burn pile was something that immediately caught the officers' attention: a human bone. Not just any bone, a bone that looked like it had been burned, charred, and discarded. The discovery sent a chilling shockwave through the investigation, leaving the officers stunned and confused. Was it really human? What had happened here? Sheila's explanation was bizarre, to say the least. She claimed that the bone was part of an animal, possibly from a rabbit, but there was no way to ignore the possibility that this could be the remains of a human being. The officers were forced to consider the grim possibility that County's fate was not as simple as Sheila had suggested. What had happened to him? Was he really alive and just hiding from his family? Or was there something far more sinister at play? The discovery of the bone was the first crack in Sheila's carefully constructed facade. From that moment on, the investigation would escalate from a welfare check into a full-blown homicide inquiry. Sheila had given them the perfect cover-up with her story of County leaving, but the discovery of that bone threw everything into question. As the police began to search further, they uncovered more disturbing details. Sheila was not a woman who easily gave up her secrets. She was evasive and combative, each answer she provided to the officers raising more questions than it answered. There were small inconsistencies in her stories that couldn't be ignored, and while Sheila maintained a calm, almost robotic demeanor, there was a palpable sense of unease creeping in. The officers were left with more questions than answers, but one thing became very clear. Sheila Labarre was hiding something, and the bone in the burn pile was just the first piece of the puzzle. With each passing moment, the officers knew that they were dealing with more than just a missing persons case. Sheila's behavior, her strange explanations, and the unsettling discovery were all pointing toward a darker reality. And, in the hours and days to come, they would uncover even more horrifying truths. This was just the beginning. The discovery of the burned bone behind Sheila Labarre's home was the first critical clue that led authorities to suspect foul play. However, it was only the beginning of a far more twisted tale. What would follow would reveal the chilling lies Sheila had carefully crafted to cover her tracks, and the dark secrets she was desperately trying to conceal. The moment police found the bone in the burn pile, they knew they were no longer dealing with a routine welfare check or a case of a missing person. Something far more sinister was unfolding. With the bone now confirmed to be human, the officers realized they were potentially looking at a homicide. But as they questioned Sheila about County's whereabouts, she remained calm, even oddly detached. She insisted, repeatedly, that he was simply gone, that he had left her home to go to Massachusetts. For the officers, Sheila's cool demeanor only made them more suspicious. It was as though she was trying to convince them of something that didn't make sense. But she wasn't just sticking to one story. Every time they pressed her for more details, Sheila's version of events seemed to change, adding more layers of confusion. She had told the police earlier that County was simply away, but now she spoke of him as if he were a fleeting figure, a man who could simply vanish without a trace. Each contradictory statement raised red flags. Still, they had no concrete evidence to suggest Sheila had killed County. Yet. They needed more, but their growing suspicions about Sheila were starting to form a clear picture. Sheila's inability to keep her story straight, the bone in the burn pile, and her strange behavior were enough to keep the officers on edge. Every word Sheila spoke seemed calculated to cover up something, and it wasn't just County's sudden disappearance. As days passed, more evidence would surface that pointed to Sheila's involvement in a gruesome crime. But first, the police would have to dig deeper into her history and uncover the disturbing patterns of her past. The officers learned that Sheila Labarre had a violent, checkered past with a string of troubled relationships. She was no stranger to conflict, often getting into explosive arguments with men she was romantically involved with, and frequently claiming they had abandoned her. What made this case different was the growing suspicion that Sheila had taken matters into her own hands, resorting to murder to rid herself of those who were either no longer useful to her or who had become an obstacle in her life. One of the most chilling aspects of the investigation was Sheila's consistent, almost mechanical demeanor. She was not the desperate, frantic woman one might expect from someone who had just experienced the loss of a loved one. Instead, she was oddly composed. When the police questioned her further, she maintained a calculated calm, always repeating the same vague stories about County's departure. But there was one key element in her story that began to unravel her carefully woven narrative. Sheila had been caught in a lie before. Back in February, when police had come to check on County's welfare, Sheila had lied to them outright, claiming that he wasn't home. The officers had been suspicious even then, but without solid evidence to confront her, they had no choice but to leave. When they returned on March 24th, however, the circumstances had changed. Sheila's inconsistency in her responses and her body language now revealed more than her words ever could. Meanwhile, the tension between the officers and Sheila escalated. She began to grow increasingly defensive. At one point, when Sergeant Gallagher asked to check the house again, Sheila hesitated for only a brief moment before allowing the officers to enter. It was clear that the officers were not going to leave without searching her home. When they entered, they immediately noticed something else that would later become a key piece of evidence. A large section of floorboards in the living room had been recently disturbed. The officers pressed Sheila further, and this time she seemed to become more agitated. Her responses became even more evasive, and she began to talk in circles. She insisted that County had been fine when he left, but couldn't explain why his family was so worried. Why hadn't she reported his disappearance? Why hadn't she tried harder to make contact with him? The questions mounted, and Sheila's answers became more and more erratic. But the most damning moment of the investigation came when Sheila's ex-husband, who had been contacted by police for further insight into her past behavior, provided a disturbing revelation. He told them about Sheila's violent tendencies, particularly her explosive anger when she felt betrayed. Sheila had never been one to take rejection lightly, and there were whispers of her possible involvement in past violent incidents. It painted a terrifying picture, one where Sheila might have had the motive, means, and opportunity to harm Kenneth County. The ex-husband's statements to the police were the tipping point. Armed with growing suspicions and mounting evidence, the police returned to the house once again, this time with a search warrant. As they scoured the property, they uncovered even more chilling evidence: blood-stained clothing, large amounts of bleach, and signs of a struggle. Everything pointed to one horrifying conclusion. Sheila Labarre had not only lied to the police, she had murdered Kenneth County. But the full extent of the crime was still unknown. The question now was, how far would Sheila go to protect her twisted secrets? What had really happened to Kenneth County? And how would Sheila explain away the damning evidence that was now being uncovered in every corner of her home? It wouldn't be long before the answers to these questions would become all too clear. By the time Sheila Labarre was formally arrested, the full weight of her twisted actions was becoming undeniable. Her earlier attempts to deflect suspicion, her evasive answers, and her cold demeanor were no longer enough to protect her from the reality of the investigation. As the officers pieced together the disturbing evidence from the search, Sheila's past and present began to converge in an unmistakable, horrifying way. But even as the evidence piled up, Sheila remained calm. That was until one crucial moment, when the walls around her finally began to close in. The breakthrough came when Sheila was brought in for questioning after the search of her home. It was a rainy day when they led her into the interrogation room, where the air was thick with tension. The officers had enough to charge her, but they needed her confession to solidify their case. Sergeant Gallagher and Detective Jacobs, both seasoned investigators, had a clear strategy in mind. They weren't going to shout or threaten her. Instead, they would wait for the cracks to show in Sheila's emotional armor. And show they did. Sheila sat there in silence for a while, her eyes fixed on the table. The initial calmness she exhibited quickly started to dissipate under the pressure of the officers' steady probing questions. It was clear that the police had the evidence and that they were closing in on her. The bone fragments, the bloodstains, the disturbed floorboards, each piece of the puzzle was a direct link to a brutal crime. But Sheila still refused to give in, at least not until Gallagher dropped a bombshell. "You know, Sheila," Gallagher began, his voice steady and authoritative. "We found the bone and we know it's County's. We also found bloodstains in your house. So, unless you want us to charge you with murder, now is the time to tell us what really happened." There was a brief pause before Sheila's eyes flickered. Her face, usually masked in a stoic expression, betrayed something. Perhaps fear, perhaps resignation. But something shifted. Sheila Labarre, the woman who had expertly avoided the truth for so long, was about to break. She began speaking slowly, her voice shaky at first as she tried to recall the events leading up to County's death. What she said next was chilling, a confession that would stun even the most seasoned officers in the room. Sheila admitted that Kenneth County had been living with her for several months, and their relationship had grown increasingly volatile. At first, she claimed, things had been fine, but the tension between them had slowly escalated. Sheila described how County had become more difficult to control, refusing to do what she asked, often getting frustrated with her behavior. The officers could sense Sheila's attempt to paint herself as a victim, but it was hard to ignore the underlying coldness in her tone as she described the events that led up to his death. The most harrowing part of Sheila's confession was when she described the moment of the murder. According to Sheila, it was a night like any other, except this time County had pushed her too far. An argument had turned physical, and Sheila, in a sudden fit of rage, had killed him. Her eyes never left the officer's face as she recounted how she struck him. "I just snapped," she admitted in a flat voice. "He wouldn't listen. He never listens." She went on to explain that after she had killed County, she didn't know what to do. She was alone in her house, terrified of the consequences of her actions, and so she took extreme measures to cover up the crime. Sheila's story about how she disposed of the body was just as disturbing. She explained how she had burned the remains in the pile behind her home. attempting to destroy any trace of evidence. Sheila even mentioned how she tried to clean the blood from the floorboards, an attempt to cover her tracks that only made her actions more obvious to investigators. But as the confession continued, a deeper horror emerged, one that suggested Sheila's actions were not entirely out of impulse. Sheila's cold, methodical approach to the crime hinted at something darker, premeditation. She wasn't just covering up a sudden act of violence, she had been planning it. The officers began to connect the dots, recognizing patterns in her behavior that indicated this murder was not an isolated incident. This wasn't just the story of a woman who had killed in a fit of rage. It was the story of a woman who had calculated every step, carefully hiding the truth for months. "I thought if I made him disappear, they'd never find out," Sheila said, her voice growing distant as though she were detached from the enormity of her actions. "He was the problem, and I had to get rid of him." As Sheila's confession grew more detailed, the investigators noticed her reluctance to show true remorse. Unlike many people who would express sorrow or regret, Sheila seemed almost indifferent. There was no real emotional depth in her words, just the cold, calculated nature of someone who had grown accustomed to manipulating the truth. When the confession ended, the officers were left in stunned silence. They had all the details now. The brutal murder, the cover-up, and the eerie calmness with which Sheila had carried it all out. But there was one final piece of the puzzle still missing. Sheila had not yet fully explained why she had killed Kenneth County. Was it the result of a single argument? Or had there been something darker brewing beneath the surface? And that's when Sheila gave them her final unsettling answer. To understand the full horror of Sheila Labarre's crimes, it's crucial to examine the years leading up to the murders. Long before the world knew her name, Sheila had been laying the groundwork for a life of control, manipulation, and violence. Her chilling story didn't begin with Kenneth County or Michael Deloge. It was rooted in a dark past marked by abusive relationships, mental instability, and an uncanny ability to manipulate those around her. Sheila Labarre was born on July 4, 1958, in Fort Payne, Alabama. From a young age, she lived in an environment filled with dysfunction and abuse. Her father, an alcoholic, was said to be controlling and physically abusive, and there were whispered allegations of something even more sinister: sexual abuse. Sheila's sister, Lynn Nugent, later testified that their childhood home was a place of pain and fear, and that Sheila bore the brunt of their father's anger. These early experiences shaped Sheila into someone who viewed relationships as power struggles. She learned to manipulate those around her, using her charm and intelligence to get what she wanted. But beneath the surface, there was a deep, seething anger, a desire to reclaim the power she felt had been taken from her as a child. Sheila's adult life was a series of tumultuous relationships, each one more destructive than the last. Her first marriage to John Baxter ended abruptly when her husband discovered that Sheila had been locking his young daughter in a closet while he was at work. Furious, he divorced her after just a few weeks. Sheila moved on quickly, remarrying Ronnie Jennings, a man who would later describe her as brilliant but dangerous. Their marriage was plagued by violent arguments, and Ronnie claimed that Sheila's unpredictable temper often left him fearing for his life. During their 4-year marriage, Sheila attempted suicide, a pattern she would repeat in later years. Ronnie's mother, Catherine Jennings, recalled a particularly disturbing incident when her son stayed awake all night, clutching scissors, afraid Sheila would attack him while he slept. Sheila was eventually hospitalized for her mental health, but the intervention seemed to have little lasting effect. In 1987, Sheila's life took a dramatic turn when she answered a personal ad from Dr. Wilfred Labarre, a wealthy chiropractor in Epping, New Hampshire. Wilfred, a widower, was taken by Sheila's charm, and she quickly became a fixture in his life. Though they never married, Sheila took his last name and moved on to his sprawling 115-acre horse farm. To the outside world, Sheila appeared to be a devoted partner and caretaker. In reality, she was steadily taking control of Wilfred's life and finances. Wilfred's daughter, Laura Malice, grew suspicious of Sheila almost immediately. She accused Sheila of manipulating her father, isolating him from his family, and even threatening him with violence. According to court documents, Sheila once chased Wilfred with a gun and allegedly tried to convince an ex-boyfriend to kill him. When Wilfred died suddenly in 2000, Sheila inherited his entire estate, valued at over $2 million. There were whispers of foul play, with some suspecting that Sheila had poisoned him, but no charges were ever filed. The inheritance gave Sheila the financial freedom to live on the farm, but her behavior grew increasingly erratic. Neighbors and police officers in Epping knew her as an eccentric, frequently calling the police to report everything from suspicious vehicles to imaginary intruders. Over the years, the Epping Police Department received more than 100 calls from Sheila, and officers often dreaded dealing with her. She had a reputation for being flirtatious and inappropriate with male officers, sometimes answering the door in various stages of undress. Her unpredictable behavior earned her the nickname Crazy Sheila, but her neighbors had no idea how dangerous she truly was. One of Sheila's most disturbing traits was her ability to prey on vulnerable men. She often targeted those who were homeless, mentally ill, or otherwise isolated, offering them a place to stay at her farm. To some, she seemed like a generous and caring woman, but her true motives were far darker. Once these men moved in, Sheila would begin to assert control over every aspect of their lives. She manipulated them emotionally, cut them off from their families, and subjected them to both psychological and physical abuse. The case of James Brackett was one of the earliest examples of Sheila's escalating violence. In 1998, Sheila was charged with stabbing Brackett in the head with a pair of scissors during an argument. The charges were later dropped, but the incident revealed a pattern of brutality that would only worsen over time. Sheila also had a history of abusing animals, a chilling red flag often associated with future violent offenders. Neighbors reported hearing screams from the farm and witnessing injured animals, but nothing was ever done to stop her. By the time Sheila met Michael Deloge in 2004, her pattern was well established. Michael, a developmentally disabled man, was living in a homeless shelter when Sheila lured him to her farm. At first, Michael's family thought Sheila was helping him get back on his feet, but it wasn't long before they noticed alarming changes in his behavior. He stopped contacting his family, became increasingly withdrawn, and was frequently seen with bruises and cuts. Michael's stepfather later recalled a chilling moment when Michael appeared in a video, accusing his mother of allowing him to be abused as a child.
Who the hell is this Tony? And if there is a Tony, why the hell did you let him bother me, touch me, molest me? And where did this happen? And who was around? Why didn't anything happen? I cannot believe you did that. I cannot believe you let that happen. I've been messed up since that visit, thinking about this. And now I got all this repressed hatred.
The words his stepfather believed weren't Michael's, they were Sheila's. Michael disappeared in late 2005. Sheila claimed he had left the farm, but his family suspected otherwise. Their worst fears were confirmed when police found evidence linking Sheila to his death during the investigation into Kenneth County. Bloodstains, bone fragments, and other incriminating evidence painted a horrifying picture of what had happened to Michael. Looking back, it was clear that Sheila Labarre had spent years honing her methods of control and violence. Her past relationships were littered with red flags, patterns of abuse, manipulation, and cruelty that escalated over time. The murders of Kenneth County and Michael Deloge were not isolated acts of rage. They were the culmination of decades of unchecked violence and a deeply twisted psyche. When Michael Deloge first met Sheila Labarre, he was just another vulnerable man in a life filled with struggle. A developmentally disabled man in his 30s, Michael was living in a homeless shelter when he crossed paths with Sheila in 2004. She was charismatic, persuasive, and seemingly kind. To Michael, Sheila appeared to offer the possibility of a better life, a place to stay on her secluded farm, away from the chaos of homelessness and his uncertain future. At first, Michael's family was hopeful. They thought Sheila might be the one to help him get back on track, offering him a safe and stable environment. Little did they know Sheila's so-called help was nothing more than the beginning of Michael's descent into a terrifying and controlled nightmare. Michael's family began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. His once frequent phone calls and visits ceased. When they did hear from him, His words were odd, almost rehearsed. He began to sound more withdrawn, speaking about Sheila in ways that hinted at a sinister power dynamic. His mother, Barbara, grew concerned when Michael spoke of Sheila as though she were a mother figure to him. But there was something unsettling in his tone, a trace of fear rather than gratitude. In 2005, Michael's stepfather, Jim Deloge, made several attempts to reach him. He went to Sheila's farm, knocking on the door and asking if Michael was there. Sheila's responses were vague, evasive. She insisted Michael was fine but was now out on his own, distancing himself from his family. Michael's family was alarmed, especially when Sheila began to suggest that Michael had cut all ties with them by choice. But Michael's stepfather wasn't convinced. He attempted to visit the farm several times, but Sheila always found a way to dismiss him. Michael's behavior had grown increasingly erratic, and his family feared the worst. At one point, Jim overheard Sheila telling Michael that he should stop contacting his family. They didn't care about him. Sheila told Michael that his family was against him, convincing him that they were the ones who had abandoned him, not the other way around. But the final straw came when Jim received a disturbing message from Sheila. Sheila called Michael's family on December 20th, 2005. The phone call came at a time when they had not heard from Michael for weeks, and Sheila was far from reassuring. Sheila claimed Michael had left her farm, gone to find himself, or perhaps simply to start over. She had no idea where he had gone, she said, and seemed somewhat evasive about answering any further questions. But Barbara Deloge was suspicious. It was uncharacteristic of Michael to simply vanish without a trace. A week later, Michael's stepfather and his brother, with the assistance of law enforcement, went to the farm to search for him. Sheila claimed that she had no idea where Michael was, but the conditions of the farm began to raise red flags. Michael's belongings, his sneakers, his jacket, and items from his childhood were found scattered around the property. It wasn't just neglect, it was an eerie sign of something far more sinister. Sheila's story didn't add up. According to the police and Michael's family, she had told several conflicting stories about Michael's departure. One version had him leaving for Massachusetts, while in another she claimed he was simply gone on a journey of self-discovery. But there were no signs that he had ever left. The more they pressed Sheila for information, the more erratic and defensive she became. Law enforcement officials began to suspect that something terrible had happened to Michael on Sheila's farm. Sheila's story became less credible with each passing day. The breaking point came when police were granted access to Sheila's property in January 2006. What they found would send shockwaves through the investigation. Bloodstains were discovered in several locations on the property, some of it spattered on the walls, others soaked into the ground. The officers uncovered human bone fragments hidden in a burn pile near the barn. The remains were later confirmed to be Michael Deloge's. The gruesome discovery sent chills down the spine of investigators. How had Sheila been able to hide the murder so effectively? The evidence suggested a calculated and cold-blooded execution of a vulnerable young man, one who had trusted her and who she had manipulated for months. Police now believed that Sheila had killed Michael, dismembered his body, and tried to dispose of the remains in a way that would ensure he could never be found. But Sheila's twisted narrative didn't end there. When confronted by police, she denied any involvement in Michael's death. She maintained that he had simply left, as she had said. She even went so far as to imply that Michael had run away, perhaps in the same way he had tried to escape his own personal demons. But there were no answers to the one question everyone was asking. Why would a young man like Michael suddenly disappear without a trace, leaving his family in such anguish? The evidence was mounting. It was becoming clear that Sheila Labarre had become a master manipulator, drawing in vulnerable individuals, using their weaknesses to control them, and then disposing of them when they outlived their usefulness. She was a predator, and Michael Deloge was another victim of her insatiable need for power and control. Kenneth County's story began much like the others, a vulnerable man searching for something. He was 24 years old, mentally disabled, and had lived a life of struggle. Living in a small trailer in New Hampshire, he was isolated from his family and community, which made him an easy target for Sheila Labarre. Much like Michael Deloge, County had few resources and even fewer options. Sheila, ever the manipulator, saw in him another opportunity for control and, ultimately, another victim. County's first interaction with Sheila occurred in early 2005, when he met her through a mutual acquaintance. Sheila's charm and promise of safety immediately won him over. She offered him a place to stay on her farm, just as she had done with Michael. Initially, things seemed to go smoothly. County, despite his personal struggles, believed he had found a caring woman willing to help him escape the isolation of his life. But Sheila's help, like all her previous offers, came with a dark and terrifying catch. At first, County's family was grateful. They didn't know much about Sheila Labarre, but they were hopeful that she could help Kenneth build a better life for himself. However, they quickly realized that Sheila's version of help came with strings attached, strings that led to Kenneth's eventual disappearance and death. Kenneth's family began to get concerned when they noticed that he had stopped reaching out. Calls and visits went unanswered, and when they did manage to get in touch with Sheila, her stories about Kenneth's whereabouts grew more and more inconsistent. Sheila would tell them that Kenneth was fine, but would also claim that he had suddenly decided to cut ties with his family, just like she had claimed with Michael Deloge. The narrative was eerily familiar to what Sheila had told others. By March 2006, County's mother, Pat, was frantic. She had not heard from her son in over a month. She went to the police, but Sheila had a ready explanation for everything. She told the police that Kenneth had been with her, but he had left to go to Massachusetts. His family, Sheila claimed, was simply overreacting. But when County's family pressed further, Sheila's story started to crack. The police were growing suspicious, especially when Sheila's conflicting statements were scrutinized. County had not left for Massachusetts, as Sheila had claimed, nor had he made contact with anyone since February. His family was certain that something had gone terribly wrong. Sheila's behavior, too, was becoming more erratic. She seemed defensive and even hostile when the police inquired about Kenneth. It was clear that she was hiding something dark and sinister. The investigation into Kenneth's disappearance gained momentum on March 24, 2006, when police finally got a break. Sheila had been evasive about granting them access to her property, but after a series of tense interactions and growing suspicions, law enforcement officials arrived at her farm early in the morning. Sheila, ever the manipulator, tried to present a calm demeanor, but the officers immediately noticed the signs of distress. The farm had an unsettling feel, a sense that something terrible had occurred, but it wasn't until they entered the barn that they uncovered the horrifying truth. Bloodstains were found splattered across the barn floor and walls. They also discovered a pile of burnt items, and when investigators sifted through the charred remains, they found what they feared: human bone fragments. The grisly discovery left little doubt. Sheila Labarre had murdered Kenneth County, but what made this crime even more chilling was the extent of her manipulation. Sheila had carefully constructed a web of lies, convincing Kenneth that he had nothing left in the world, no family, no hope, before killing him and attempting to destroy all evidence of her crime. In a twisted irony, Sheila had used the same techniques of emotional and psychological manipulation that she had perfected with Michael Deloge, and now, County had become yet another pawn in her cruel game. When Sheila was confronted, she initially denied everything. She claimed that Kenneth had left of his own accord, just as she had claimed with the other men. But the evidence was overwhelming. Sheila's own phone records indicated that she had been in contact with Kenneth shortly before his death, and her attempts to cover up his murder only deepened the investigation. As police continued to search her property, they found further evidence linking Sheila to the crime. There were no signs that Kenneth had left the farm willingly. Instead, it became clear that Sheila had lured him there under false pretenses and killed him in cold blood. The timeline of Kenneth's death was pieced together over several weeks, but investigators soon realized that Sheila's story was falling apart. In the weeks leading up to his death, Sheila had begun making strange comments to neighbors, saying that Kenneth was getting on her nerves. She would claim to friends and acquaintances that County was a burden and that she needed to get rid of him. In retrospect, these chilling comments seemed like a premonition of the grisly murder to come. But it was the phone call Sheila made on the night of March 24, 2006, that sealed her fate. The police had obtained a recording of her voice, heard on the line just moments before County's death. The recording was harrowing. County was heard vomiting, followed by Sheila's voice saying he had fainted. This was the same night police arrived at the farm, and it became clear that Sheila's lies were unraveling before her eyes. At this point, Sheila Labarre's fate was sealed. She was arrested and charged with the murder of Kenneth County. During her interrogation, she remained cold and defiant, refusing to acknowledge the horror she had unleashed. In her mind, she was still in control, still the manipulator, still the mastermind. When Sheila Labarre was finally arrested for the murder of Kenneth County, the criminal justice system began its slow, deliberate process of bringing her to trial. However, what followed was not just a standard legal battle, but a chilling glimpse into the mind of a woman who had spent years evading the law and manipulating everyone around her. At the center of Sheila's trial was a defense that would send shivers down the spine of anyone familiar with her history. Sheila claimed that she was not guilty of murder because she was legally insane. This defense was not entirely new. Sheila had previously attempted to paint herself as a victim, always justifying her actions as the result of external forces or mental instability. But the court was not easily swayed. For the first time, Sheila's manipulative nature was on full display, and the legal system would need to unravel her twisted psyche to determine whether she was truly insane or just a cold, calculating murderer. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Sheila had lured Kenneth County to her property under false pretenses, isolated him from his family, and then murdered him in cold blood. The evidence of her guilt was overwhelming. The discovery of Kenneth's remains in the burnt pile on her farm, the bloodstains found in the barn, and the chilling audio recordings all pointed to a single conclusion. Sheila Labarre was responsible for his death. But Sheila's defense team took a different route. They argued that Sheila's psychological state was severely impaired at the time of Kenneth's murder. They pointed to her long history of mental health issues, including borderline personality disorder and an alleged traumatic past. They claimed that Sheila's actions were the result of years of abuse and neglect, leading her to develop a warped sense of reality. Her lawyers painted a picture of a woman who was not fully aware of the consequences of her actions, suggesting that Sheila's manipulative behavior was simply a symptom of her mental illness. In court, Sheila's defense attorneys presented experts who testified that she had suffered from a variety of psychological disorders, which they argued contributed to her violent tendencies. These experts painted a portrait of a woman who was unable to distinguish between right and wrong due to her mental state. Some claimed that Sheila's interactions with her victims were the result of a delusional relationship that she had constructed in her mind. According to these experts, Sheila believed she was acting out of a twisted sense of love and care for her victims, even as she brutally murdered them. This defense strategy, however, was met with skepticism from the prosecution. The state presented its own experts who argued that Sheila was fully aware of her actions and was not mentally incapacitated during the murders. They pointed out the cold and calculated nature of her crimes, suggesting that Sheila's ability to plan, manipulate, and deceive her victims was inconsistent with the behavior of someone suffering from severe mental illness. The prosecution highlighted the fact that Sheila had carefully staged her crime scene and attempted to cover up the evidence of her crime, showing a level of awareness that belied her defense of insanity. As the trial unfolded, Sheila's manipulative nature became more and more apparent. She often appeared calm and collected in court, almost as if she were performing for an audience. Her behavior was a stark contrast to the chaotic and violent actions she had taken in the months leading up to County's death. It was clear that Sheila was playing the system, attempting to convince the court that she was simply a victim of her circumstances, rather than a ruthless killer. But it wasn't just her behavior in court that raised eyebrows. Sheila's interactions with the victims' families were just as disturbing. During the trial, Sheila maintained a cold and detached attitude towards Kenneth County's family, showing little remorse for the suffering she had caused. When confronted with the impact of her actions on County's mother, she responded with indifference, as if she were completely removed from the pain she had inflicted. This lack of empathy and remorse only served to further underscore the prosecution's argument that Sheila was fully aware of the gravity of her crimes. As the trial progressed, the jury was confronted with the complex issue of Sheila's mental state. Was she truly insane, or was she simply a woman who had used her psychological issues as an excuse for her actions? The defense painted a picture of a woman who had been scarred by her past, while the prosecution portrayed Sheila as a cold-blooded murderer who had carefully planned and executed her crimes. In the end, the jury had to decide whether Sheila was responsible for her actions or whether her mental state absolved her of guilt. They deliberated for hours, weighing the evidence and testimony presented by both sides. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, as the fate of a woman who had committed such heinous acts rested in the hands of 12 strangers. When the verdict was finally announced, the room fell silent. Sheila Labarre was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Kenneth County. The jury had rejected the insanity defense, determining that Sheila was fully aware of her actions and the consequences they would have. This verdict was a victory for justice, but it also revealed something deeper. Sheila Labarre was not the fragile, mentally unstable woman she had tried to portray. She was a calculated, manipulative killer, someone who had used her mental health history as a shield to escape the consequences of her actions. The trial of Sheila Labarre not only brought justice for Kenneth County, but also revealed the true nature of a woman who had spent years deceiving and manipulating everyone around her. Sheila's defense strategy may have been based on her alleged mental illness, but it was clear to the jury and to the public that her crimes were the result of her own twisted desires and cold-blooded intentions. In the end, Sheila was sentenced to life in prison, where she would never again have the opportunity to harm another innocent person. But even in prison, Sheila Labarre's manipulative tendencies remained. Those who interacted with her behind bars reported that Sheila continued to manipulate others, using her charm and cunning to control the people around her. It seemed that even in captivity, Sheila was unable to relinquish the need for power and control that had defined her life and her crimes. The trial and subsequent conviction of Sheila Labarre served as a sobering reminder of the dangers of manipulation and control. It also shed light on the depths of her psychological disorders, revealing how she had preyed on vulnerable individuals and used them to satisfy her own twisted desires. In the end, justice was served, but the scars of Sheila's actions would last far beyond the courtroom. Life in prison for Sheila Labarre has been a far cry from the dramatic courtroom battles that had once been her stage. For the first time, Sheila was isolated from the world, her actions subjected to the rigid constraints of the correctional system. But as the walls of the prison closed in around her, Sheila's manipulative nature remained intact. In fact, her time behind bars revealed even more about her personality, this time to the people who would become her fellow inmates. Behind the prison walls, Sheila initially attempted to paint herself as a victim. She spoke to her fellow inmates about her troubled past, emphasizing her mental health issues and the alleged trauma she had experienced. She made sure to tell everyone how the world had wronged her and how she had been misunderstood. Yet, as those who interacted with her would come to learn, this was just another version of the same manipulative narrative she had crafted for herself throughout her life. Sheila's charm and ability to manipulate others were not confined to the outside world. They simply took on a different form behind bars. Many inmates reported that Sheila had a way of turning conversations in her favor, always making herself the center of attention. She would frequently find new victims, women who were vulnerable, eager for guidance, or isolated within the prison system, and would offer them a sense of protection and mentorship. But like everything else Sheila did, her help came with strings attached. She would create dependencies, subtle emotional manipulations that kept her in control. This ability to form alliances and manipulate those around her was a testament to her skill as a predator, even within the confines of the prison. One of the most striking things about Sheila's time in prison was her ability to continue to present herself as a victim. She would often downplay her role in the murders, saying that she was just misunderstood or that she was forced to act in certain ways due to her mental health. She would make sure that her fellow inmates knew she was the victim of a flawed justice system, playing on their sympathies and using her charm to make herself appear more fragile than she truly was. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like Sheila had come to terms with her crime, but those who spent time with her knew that she was just biding her time, looking for new ways to manipulate and control. While some believed her, others were less easily fooled. Inmates who saw through Sheila's facade quickly learned not to trust her. Sheila's inability to form real, genuine connections with others became apparent. She didn't just manipulate the system and the people around her. She used people as pawns in a game that only she seemed to be playing. The fact that she was serving a life sentence didn't deter her. In fact, it only intensified her need for control. In prison, Sheila's behavior was monitored, but her manipulations still had an effect. Staff members reported that she had a knack for getting into the heads of others, often using her charm and wit to disarm the guards and other prisoners. She would pretend to be compliant, to play the part, but her ultimate goal was always to gain some form of power. Her actions inside the prison revealed a woman who would never truly accept responsibility for her crimes. Instead, Sheila would spend her years in captivity, searching for ways to retain some sense of control over her environment. It wasn't just her fellow inmates that Sheila sought to influence. She also continued to manipulate her public image, attempting to control the narrative about her crimes. Interviews and media appearances were carefully staged, with Sheila presenting herself as a tragic figure who had been let down by society. She would sometimes claim that she was not really responsible for Kenneth's death, once again invoking her past trauma and mental health issues as an excuse. In one of her rare interviews, Sheila remarked that her crimes were a result of misunderstandings and that she didn't mean to kill anyone. This statement, like so many others, was designed to make her seem less culpable, to sow seeds of doubt about her role in the murders. But the truth was far darker, and Sheila's manipulations only deepened the sense of unease that surrounded her. One of the more disturbing aspects of Sheila's time in prison was the question of whether she had truly come to terms with her actions. While some experts believed that she was a psychopath, incapable of genuine remorse, others suggested that Sheila's extreme narcissism and manipulative tendencies might indicate a lack of empathy more than a true psychological disorder. Regardless of the diagnosis, Sheila's actions behind bars confirmed that she had no intention of changing. She had learned how to survive in the prison system, and her survival was predicated on her ability to continue controlling those around her. Sheila Labarre's story inside prison was one of continued manipulation, emotional abuse, and the relentless pursuit of power. Her crimes had shocked the nation, but her behavior in captivity left even more questions in their wake. Was she simply a product of her twisted mind, or was Sheila Labarre someone who knew exactly what she was doing all along? As the years passed, Sheila's manipulations continued to shape her life in prison. She would never be able to escape the consequences of her actions, but the twisted desire to control and deceive others would likely be her constant companion until her last breath. The fact that Sheila Labarre has not shown genuine remorse for her actions remains one of the most chilling aspects of her story. Behind bars, she is not a broken woman seeking redemption. She is a master manipulator, a predator who still uses her charm and intelligence to manipulate the people around her. It is clear that Sheila's dark and twisted personality is not confined to her past actions. It continues to define her, even as she sits in prison for the rest of her life. As we reflect on the tragic deaths of Kenneth County and others tied to Sheila Labarre's manipulative and murderous actions, it's impossible not to wonder, could this have been prevented? While Sheila Labarre's crimes were monstrous, they were not spontaneous acts of violence. They were the culmination of a lifetime of manipulation, abuse, and deceit, patterns that were glaringly evident to those who took the time to look. But as with many stories of abuse and crime, the signs were ignored. The system failed in a way that allowed Sheila to slip through the cracks, continuing her reign of terror unchecked for far too long. The first glaring issue lies in Sheila's upbringing and the lack of intervention that could have halted her destructive trajectory. Sheila Labarre was born in 1961 in the small town of New Hampshire, into a chaotic family environment. Her childhood was far from stable, marked by abusive relationships, neglect, and a series of troubled dynamics with her family members. Sheila's behavior from a young age was concerning. She had an early propensity for manipulation, showing signs of being extremely controlling and calculating in her interactions with others. But it wasn't just her childhood that could have given people a clue as to the danger she would become. Sheila's relationships with men were always troubled, and more often than not, ended in her accusing the men of being abusive toward her, even when she herself was the instigator. These early relationships were often characterized by intense emotional manipulation and, in some cases, physical violence. Sheila's partners were frequently described as being under her spell, unable to break free from her grasp. Her ability to manipulate and control men, especially through emotional and psychological abuse, was already well documented long before Kenneth County's death. Despite these red flags, Sheila was never held accountable for her actions, nor was she ever offered any meaningful mental health intervention. Throughout her life, she moved from one unstable relationship to another, leaving a trail of broken people in her wake. But it wasn't until she lured Kenneth County to her farm that the true danger she posed became evident to the wider community. The first interaction between Sheila and Kenneth County may have been a catalyst for his tragic end, but it was certainly not the beginning of Sheila's criminal tendencies. County, a vulnerable man with a history of mental health struggles, was just one in a long line of victims who fell prey to Sheila's manipulative charms. Friends, family members, and even police officers who interacted with Sheila during her years of normal life would later reveal that they had seen her behavior as concerning, but none of them had the courage or the knowledge to intervene. One particularly telling instance was when Sheila's former partner, Michael, came forward to testify about their tumultuous relationship. Michael had been one of Sheila's many victims, caught up in her web of deceit and emotional abuse for years. He described how Sheila would play the victim in their relationship, blaming him for the dysfunction of their dynamic, while simultaneously keeping him in a constant state of emotional manipulation. He was left feeling both guilty and helpless, unaware of how deeply he had been controlled. As is often the case with victims of emotional abuse, he was made to believe that Sheila's behavior was justified, even when it was destructive. It wasn't just Michael who failed to take action against Sheila. Local law enforcement also failed to respond adequately to the warnings that surrounded her. In fact, Sheila's behavior was well known to the police, but it took a number of years and multiple instances of manipulation and violence before she was finally arrested. She had been reported to police for suspicious activities and abusive behavior toward past partners, but the cases were either dismissed or classified as domestic disputes, misunderstood and underreported. This lack of intervention allowed Sheila to continue her reign of terror, manipulating and controlling those around her without consequence. The police response to Sheila's behavior was part of a larger systemic issue: the failure to recognize and address the dangers posed by individuals with manipulative and narcissistic traits. While the system may be equipped to deal with violent crimes or crimes of passion, it often struggles with individuals like Sheila, who may not exhibit immediate violent tendencies, but instead wield control through psychological abuse. Because Sheila was able to avoid the scrutiny that might have been applied to other offenders, she was free to continue her abuse without any real intervention. Another key element in Sheila's path to violence was the silence and complicity of the people closest to her. Family members, including Sheila's own mother, were aware of the troubling behavior she exhibited, yet they failed to intervene in meaningful ways. Her mother, in particular, was both protective and enabling, frequently covering for Sheila and dismissing warnings from others who were concerned about her behavior. This dynamic is not uncommon in cases involving narcissistic or manipulative individuals, as their behavior often leads to a skewed sense of loyalty and dependency among family members and friends. Despite Sheila's evident psychological instability and patterns of abusive behavior, her mother would later testify that she had no idea just how dangerous Sheila had become. This is a common occurrence in abusive families. Family members are often so entangled in the emotional manipulation and deceit that they fail to recognize the threat until it's too late. The absence of a strong support system for Kenneth County was also a major factor. Kenneth's family did make repeated efforts to find him when he went missing, contacting the police and raising concerns about his safety. Yet even though Sheila's behavior was suspicious, the police did not take immediate action, partly because Sheila was known for making false claims and manipulating the situation. It took several weeks before the police had enough evidence to take action, and by then, it was already too late. Sheila's mental health issues were never addressed in a meaningful way. While she was diagnosed with certain psychological disorders, she was rarely given the kind of treatment that could have mitigated her dangerous tendencies. Mental health professionals who examined Sheila in the aftermath of her arrest described her as a deeply troubled individual, exhibiting traits of narcissism and sociopathy. However, she had never been diagnosed or treated for these issues during her life, which meant that she had the freedom to act out her destructive impulses without any boundaries or therapeutic intervention. This raises an important question. Could Sheila Labarre have been stopped before she killed anyone? The answer is quite possibly yes. Had she received proper mental health care at an earlier stage in her life, or had the warning signs been taken seriously by family, friends, and law enforcement, the devastating outcome could have been avoided. Sheila's story is not just about one woman's descent into violence. It's a reflection of a system that failed to see the warning signs, failed to intervene in time, and ultimately failed the people she victimized. The tragedy of Sheila Labarre's life is that it was, in many ways, preventable. A combination of missed opportunities, a lack of proper intervention, and a failure to hold her accountable for her abuse enabled her to continue her reign of terror. The system's inability to address the psychological dangers posed by people like Sheila highlights the significant gaps that exist in law enforcement, mental health, and social services. These gaps are not just theoretical, they are deadly. As we look back on this case, the real tragedy lies not just in the murder of Kenneth County, but in the lives that could have been saved had those in positions of power and responsibility acted sooner. Sheila Labarre's story is a warning, a reminder of how dangerous it can be when we fail to recognize the signs of manipulation and abuse, and when we fail to act. In the aftermath of Sheila Labarre's conviction and the public revelation of her gruesome crimes, the question of her legacy looms large. The murders of Kenneth County and other victims have left a lasting impact on their families, the community, and the criminal justice system. But beyond the immediate horrors of her actions, Sheila's story offers important lessons about the way society handles issues of abuse, mental health, and criminal behavior. In this final section, we'll examine the broader consequences of Sheila Labarre's crimes, as well as the lessons that should be learned to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The most immediate impact of Sheila Labarre's actions was the loss of life. First and foremost, the tragic deaths of Kenneth County and her other victims. Kenneth's family, who had been desperately searching for him, were devastated when the truth of his murder finally came to light. His mother, in particular, was left to grapple with the pain of knowing that her son had been manipulated and ultimately killed by a woman who had promised him safety and companionship. For his family, the sense of loss was immeasurable, compounded by the brutal circumstances of his death, and the realization that, had they known the full extent of Sheila's manipulations, they might have been able to save him. In addition to the loss of life, Sheila's actions have had a profound effect on her own family. Sheila's mother, who had been emotionally manipulated by her daughter throughout her life, had to come to terms with the fact that the person she had tried to protect was capable of such horrific acts. The guilt and sorrow that Sheila's family members felt were exacerbated by their realization that they had failed to intervene in time, allowing Sheila's reign of terror to continue unchecked. Sheila Labarre's legacy also left a deep scar on the community of Epping, New Hampshire. Small towns often have tight-knit communities where everyone knows everyone else. In these environments, when a crime as horrific as Labarre's takes place, the shockwaves reverberate through the entire community. Neighbors and friends of Sheila, who once saw her as a quirky, if somewhat odd, individual, were forced to confront the horrifying reality of her actions. For many, the discovery of Sheila's crimes was a brutal reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind closed doors, often invisible to those who may not know how to spot the signs of manipulation and abuse. Beyond the individual victims, Sheila Labarre's legacy forces us to reflect on the broader societal failures that allowed her crimes to unfold. Sheila's life and actions exemplify many of the issues that are too often overlooked or misunderstood in cases of emotional and psychological abuse. For years, Sheila was able to manipulate her family, friends, and partners without facing significant legal consequences. She was able to exploit the system, using her charm, her ability to deceive, and the inherent biases of those around her to continue her abusive patterns without interruption. One of the key lessons that Labarre's case teaches us is the importance of recognizing and addressing narcissism and sociopathy in both personal relationships and the criminal justice system. Sheila displayed many traits of a narcissistic and sociopathic personality, manipulating those around her, lacking empathy, and engaging in reckless behavior without regard for the well-being of others. Unfortunately, because these traits don't always manifest in the form of traditional violent crime, they are often dismissed or misunderstood. For example, Sheila was able to convince law enforcement officers, mental health professionals, and even her own family that she was a victim, not a perpetrator. This type of psychological manipulation is common among individuals with narcissistic tendencies, and it highlights the need for greater awareness and education about how these personality disorders can manifest in dangerous ways. While Sheila's actions were extreme, they are not entirely unique. There are countless cases of individuals who manipulate and harm others without ever being caught, simply because their behavior is not easily recognized or understood. In Sheila's case, law enforcement's failure to act sooner is a key part of her legacy. Despite numerous reports from friends and family members about her suspicious behavior, the police did not take immediate action. They initially dismissed her history of abuse as domestic squabbles and failed to connect the dots between her manipulative actions and the increasing likelihood of her involvement in criminal behavior. This gap in law enforcement's response is something that needs to be addressed in the wake of Sheila's crimes. Better training, improved investigative techniques, and a greater focus on emotional and psychological abuse would help prevent future tragedies. Another critical lesson from Sheila's case is the need for mental health interventions to address individuals like Sheila before they cause irreversible harm. Sheila's mental health issues, likely a combination of narcissistic personality disorder, sociopathy, and perhaps other underlying disorders, were never adequately addressed during her life. Though she was diagnosed at various points with psychiatric issues, she was never provided with the care and treatment that could have potentially redirected her violent tendencies. While the justice system often focuses on individuals' criminal actions and the punishment they deserve, we must not overlook the importance of addressing underlying mental health issues that often contribute to criminal behavior. Sheila's case underscores the need for early mental health screening and intervention programs, particularly for individuals who demonstrate manipulative or abusive behaviors. A system that can identify and address these issues earlier may be able to prevent future tragedies and save lives. It's also important to note that mental health care alone is not enough if it's not paired with effective law enforcement and community awareness. There is a fine balance between treating individuals with psychological issues and holding them accountable for their actions. Sheila Labarre should have been stopped long before her crimes escalated to murder. Better collaboration between mental health professionals, law enforcement, and social services could have led to earlier intervention. Ultimately, Sheila Labarre's legacy is one that speaks to the dangers of domestic abuse, emotional manipulation, and the silencing of victims. The case is a stark reminder that abusive behavior is not always physical. It can be emotional, psychological, and financial, often operating under the radar until it's too late. Sheila's ability to control her victims through psychological abuse is a key aspect of her crimes that should not be overlooked. For victims of emotional abuse, there are often no visible scars. The pain they endure is not always easy to identify, and the consequences of emotional abuse are often downplayed or dismissed. Sheila Labarre's case highlights the importance of recognizing these less obvious forms of abuse and offering support to those who might be suffering in silence. As we look back at the horrors of Sheila Labarre's crimes, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the flaws in our systems, whether in the way we handle mental health, domestic abuse, or law enforcement. But these lessons are not just for the people who were involved in Sheila's case. They are lessons for all of us. Sheila Labarre may have taken lives, but the ultimate tragedy is that, had society acted differently, many of these lives could have been saved. Her legacy is a wake-up call, a call to action for change. And while the scars of her crimes may never fully heal, we can ensure that her story serves as a reminder of the need for vigilance, intervention, and compassion in the fight against abuse and manipulation.